Milan, the city of fashion, art, and history. Known around the world for its sleek skyscrapers, iconic cathedrals, and stylish boutiques, Milan is a city that dazzles its visitors with its beauty and elegance. Its lively streets hum with the buzz of locals and tourists alike, while its stunning architecture stands as a testament to the past. But hidden amidst the polished, glamorous exterior of this Italian metropolis lies something much darker, something that few ever speak of, but those who know to avoid. It is a place that isn't found in any tourist guide, a place where the air feels thicker, the silence deeper, and the walls seem to have witnessed horrors long forgotten by time. A hotel, standing alone in an old district, its faded elegance now a mere shadow of the grandeur it once had. It's a building that has been there for centuries, yet never quite fits in with its surroundings. Locals know it by sight and often walk by without ever giving it a second glance. It's the type of place you're told to avoid, even by those who have no clue about its sordid past. There are no signs, no flashy advertisements, no welcoming lights to guide you inside. It almost seems like it's waiting, watching, until someone foolish enough stumbles into its decaying embrace. They say it's cursed, haunted by the very souls of those who once walked its halls. Some claim it's a hotel that drives its guests mad. They say that anyone who steps inside leaves with a piece of their sanity missing, never quite the same as when they arrived. The rumors have persisted for decades, but no one really knows the truth about what happens inside those walls. Most people who have disappeared within those crumbling rooms are never found again, and those few who do return are not the same. They're hollowed out, their eyes dull with the terror of something they can never escape. The stories about this hotel have been whispered in the streets of Milan for years, passed from one curious soul to the next like some sort of twisted urban legend. Some say it's the spirits of past guests, their restless souls doomed to wander the hallways forever, while others claim that the hotel itself has a malevolent will, feeding off the fear of those who dare enter. But despite the warnings, there is always a group, a handful of people, who cannot resist the temptation to uncover the truth behind the mystery. And so it was that a group of friends, who had been living in Milan for years, decided to pay a visit to this infamous hotel. They were young, carefree, and skeptical, thinking that these were just exaggerated tales meant to spice up the history of a decaying old building. They weren't afraid. In fact, they found the idea of investigating an old haunted hotel to be thrilling. How bad could it really be, they thought. After all, Milan was a city full of stories, some a little darker than others, and this one seemed like nothing more than a ghost story designed to scare the gullible. The group had heard the rumors. Of course, everyone had. The whispers in the cafes, the hushed conversations at the local bars. But the more they heard about the hotel, the less they believed. One friend, Alex, had heard about a disappearance that happened a few years back. An American tourist who had checked into the hotel and was never seen again. But Alex dismissed it as nothing more than a miscommunication. A missing person case. It happens all the time in a busy city like Milan, right? Another friend, Rachel, had overheard a conversation in a bookstore where an older man was speaking of bloodstains that never wash away and shadows that follow you home. But she had thought little of it. Urban legends, she figured. They were meant to stir the imagination, nothing more. Still, curiosity got the best of them. One evening, after a dinner at a nearby restaurant, they decided to visit the hotel and see it for themselves. They figured they would spend a few minutes there, take a quick look around, and maybe snap a couple of photos. Nothing too serious, nothing too risky. Just a fun adventure to prove that the rumors were nothing but exaggerated stories meant to entertain tourists. They set off to the hotel, laughing among themselves, teasing each other about how easily they were going to debunk these so-called hauntings. Milan's nightlife buzzed around them. The warm glow of street lamps casting shadows on the cobblestone streets. As they walked through the darkened alleyways, their conversation turned to the strange sense of foreboding they had started to feel, but they laughed it off. There it was, standing before them, a towering building that looked out of place. The windows were dark, and the shutters were closed tight, as though the hotel was trying to shut itself off from the rest of the world. The once beautiful facade had been weathered by years of neglect. The paint on the walls was chipped and faded, and the once grand entrance seemed like a portal to another time, one filled with secrets long buried. The group stood in front of it for a moment, unsure whether they should go in. The air felt unnaturally still, as though the building itself was holding its breath. But the temptation was too great. They had come all this way. They pushed open the heavy door, which creaked loudly as it swung inward, revealing a dimly lit lobby. The floors were made of dark wood, and the walls were lined with portraits of people they didn't recognize. Faces frozen in time, their eyes following them as they moved. The atmosphere was thick with a smell of dust and something else, something faintly metallic, like blood, but not quite. Behind the reception desk, an elderly woman with a stern face greeted them, her smile tight and forced. She didn't seem surprised by their arrival, as though she had been expecting them. "You're here to stay?" she asked, her voice raspy, as though it hadn't been used in years. "No, just looking around," Rachel replied, her voice wavering slightly. She was trying to act confident, but there was something about the place that made her skin crawl. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she gave them a key to room 237, the only room available that night. As they walked away from the desk, the heavy silence of the hotel seemed to follow them, settling into their bones. As they ascended the staircase, the air grew colder. The once lively atmosphere of Milan outside seemed to fade, replaced by an oppressive stillness. The hotel seemed to come alive with every creak of the floorboards beneath their feet, every soft whisper of air that seemed to carry a warning. Room 237 awaited them, its door slightly ajar, as though it had been waiting for them too. They entered, their excitement turning into a quiet, uneasy curiosity. What they didn't know was that this hotel wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a place that had been waiting for them, waiting for someone to cross its threshold. And once they did, there was no turning back. They had unknowingly stepped into a nightmare they would never escape from. The hotel had marked them, and now it was watching them. The group of friends checked into the hotel, their laughter echoing through the dimly lit lobby as they tried to shake off the eerie vibes creeping over them. They exchanged jokes, hoping to ease the discomfort. But the air in the lobby felt thick, like the building itself was holding its breath. Every creak of the floorboards beneath their feet seemed too loud, too deliberate. The walls, lined with faded portraits and dusty curtains, seemed to watch their every move. The only sounds were their voices and the faint hum of an old chandelier above them. Yet, despite the strange atmosphere, they brushed it off as nothing more than the charm of an old hotel. The hotel staff, too, were unsettling in their quiet politeness. The woman behind the front desk gave them an unsettlingly soft smile, her eyes never quite meeting theirs, as though she was carefully observing them. When she spoke, her voice was too smooth, too rehearsed, like someone used to repeating the same words day after day. She didn't seem to be bothered by the strange questions they asked, nor did she show any curiosity about their stay. She simply handed them a brass key and gestured for them to follow the hallway toward room 237. Her movements were so calm, it was almost robotic. The group exchanged uneasy glances as they made their way to the room. It wasn't like them to feel unsettled, but something about this place made them feel like they were trespassing, like they weren't supposed to be here. The hallway stretched on longer than they expected, each step seeming to echo off the walls, the silence pressing in on them from all sides. The flickering lights above them cast shadows that seemed to shift when they weren't looking. Their footsteps quickened as they neared the door, eager to get inside, away from the heavy atmosphere of the hallway. When they finally reached room 237, they paused in front of the door. It was slightly ajar, as though it had been waiting for them, anticipating their arrival. They exchanged uneasy glances before pushing the door open. The rusty hinges protesting with a loud creak. The first thing they noticed was the smell. A faint odor, something rotting but not overpowering. It wasn't the kind of smell you could easily identify. It was something in between, something unsettling that made their stomachs turn. Rachel frowned, sniffing the air. "What's that smell? It's strange." "It's probably just the age of the building," Alex said, trying to brush it off, though his voice lacked conviction. Old places like this have a way of smelling funny. They moved further into the room, trying to ignore the strange odor. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, faded floral patterns that were once elegant but now looked tired and worn. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet as they walked, each step causing a shiver to run down their spines. It was like the room itself was alive, reacting to their presence. The bed, covered with a threadbare quilt, sat in the center of the room, its headboard pressed against the wall. There was a small dresser near the window, its drawers slightly open, revealing nothing but empty spaces. There was a feeling of abandonment in the room, a sense that it hadn't been used in years. But it wasn't the usual feeling you get in an old, forgotten space. It was different. There was something wrong here, something out of place. The air itself seemed to press in on them, making it harder to breathe. As they unpacked, they tried to laugh off their growing discomfort, but the room had a way of creeping into their thoughts. It wasn't just the smell, or the peeling wallpaper, or the creaky floorboards. It was everything. The way the shadows in the corners seemed to move when they weren't looking. The way the faint sound of whispers filled the silence, too soft to catch, but still present, like something was trying to speak to them from the darkness. It was as if the room was alive, watching them, waiting for them to acknowledge its presence. The group sat on the bed, trying to relax, but it was hard to shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Every sound in the room felt too sharp, too deliberate. They could hear the creak of the floorboards beneath them, the distant hum of something that seemed to come from the walls. But every time they turned to look, there was nothing there. "Maybe we should go out and grab a drink," Rachel suggested, trying to break the tension. "This place is freaking me out." "Yeah, maybe a walk around the block would do us good," Mark added, glancing nervously at the window. The darkness outside seemed to press in, like the night was coming to swallow them whole. But as they reached for their coats, something made them stop. They froze in place, their eyes drawn to the corner of the room where the shadows seemed darker than the rest. It was subtle at first, a slight movement, almost too small to notice. But then it happened again, a shift, a faint flicker of something moving in the darkness. "Did you see that?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. Alex stood still, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't want to believe what he thought he had seen, but the longer he stared at the shadows, the more real it became. He shook his head, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. "It's nothing," he muttered. "Just shadows." But even as he said the words, he could feel the weight of something watching him, something that wasn't quite right. The air seemed thicker, heavier, pressing down on them like a tangible force. They tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to them like a second skin. Mark lay down on the bed, pulling the covers over his head in an attempt to block out the growing unease. But the whispers followed him, curling around the edges of his mind like tendrils, invading his thoughts. Every time he closed his eyes, he could hear them more clearly, though their words were unintelligible. Rachel and Alex, too, couldn't escape the growing sense of discomfort. The room felt colder now, the air thick with something they couldn't name. It wasn't just the old building. It wasn't just the shadows or the smell. It was something deeper, something that seemed to have a life of its own. As the night wore on, sleep became impossible. They tossed and turned, but no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The whispers filled their minds, growing louder and more insistent, until it felt like the room was closing in on them. They pulled the blankets over their heads, trying to block out the sounds, but it didn't work. The air grew colder, and the whispers became clearer, more distinct, as if they were standing just behind them. It was then that they realized it wasn't just the building, it wasn't just the hotel, it was the room, the very space they occupied. The room had a way of making you feel small, insignificant, as though you were nothing more than a pawn in a game it controlled. It was a room that didn't just house you, it consumed you, slowly, piece by piece, until you no longer recognized yourself. And so, they lay there in silence, wide awake, as the whispers continued to swirl around them, carrying with them a promise of something far worse than they had ever imagined. Something was coming. Something that had been waiting for them, and it would not let them leave. By the second night, everything had changed. The playful teasing that had filled their first night at the hotel had long since faded. The excitement and curiosity had been replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. The air in the room was still unnaturally thick, and despite the late hour, none of the friends could shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the unsettling silence or the eerie whispers from the walls, but something deeper, something they couldn't yet understand. It wasn't until the middle of the night that things truly began to spiral into something unexplainable. Rachel woke up suddenly, her body tense, her heart racing. The room felt like it was suffocating her. The usual warm air was gone, replaced by an icy chill that seeped into her bones. She pulled the blanket closer, trying to shake off the feeling of coldness that seemed to creep from the very walls. She opened her eyes, blinking against the darkness, and immediately felt a strange weight pressing on her chest. The shadows in the room were deeper now, more pronounced, as if they had shifted in the night. She turned her head towards the window, hoping to see the comforting lights of the city outside. But there was nothing but blackness. The curtains hung still, but there was an odd sense of movement in the air, like the room itself was alive. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. At first, it was a mere shadow, but then it became clearer. A figure standing by the window, almost perfectly still. A woman. Her face was pale, almost sickly, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right into Rachel's soul. Her features were gaunt, her skin stretched thin over sharp bones. The woman's dark hair hung limp, almost as if it were wet, and her clothes, a tattered old gown, seemed to blend with the darkness around her. But the eyes, those eyes, were unmistakable. They locked onto Rachel's with a gaze that was both empty and filled with an intense, unsettling presence. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, she couldn't move. Her body felt paralyzed, as though she were glued to the bed, unable to tear her eyes away from the woman in the window. The figure stood perfectly still, and yet it felt like she was alive, watching, waiting. Rachel's pulse quickened, and she finally found the strength to scream. She threw herself back, stumbling to turn on the bedside lamp. The room flooded with light, and in that instant, the figure, Alex's voice came from the bed next to her, groggy and filled with concern. He had awoken from the sound of her scream, his eyes blinking in the sudden light. I saw something, Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. A woman. She was right there, by the window. I saw her eyes. She was looking straight at me. Alex sat up, rubbing his eyes and shaking his head. Rachel, it's just a bad dream. You were probably half asleep. There's nothing there. Rachel looked back toward the window, but now it was just a blank sheet of darkness. No figure, no pale woman staring back at her. She shook her head, trying to convince herself that it was just her imagination. Maybe it was a nightmare, a figment of her tired mind. But even as she tried to tell herself that, she couldn't escape the haunting image of the woman's hollow eyes. The others groggily woke up at the commotion, dismissing Rachel's claims as a result of a restless night. They reassured her, though none of them could fully shake off the eerie feeling that lingered in the room. They tried to laugh it off, but Rachel wasn't convinced. She couldn't forget those eyes, the coldness, the emptiness. It felt like the woman wasn't just an apparition. She was a presence, something that existed within the very walls of the hotel. As the night dragged on, the whispers began again. At first, they were faint, barely audible, like soft murmurs carried on the wind. But they grew louder, more insistent, until Rachel could hear them clearly. Voices speaking in a language she couldn't understand, a language that seemed to come from every direction, from the very walls themselves. She tried to drown it out, but the sound was all around her, gnawing at her thoughts. She couldn't tell if the others heard it too, but they seemed unaffected, their breathing steady as they fell into fitful sleep. But Rachel, she lay wide-eyed, unable to shake the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press in on her from all sides. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping to an almost unbearable chill. Every breath she took seemed to fog in the air, and the whispers became clearer, more distinct. She couldn't tell if they were real, or if it was all just in her head, but they were there. Help me. The words were faint, like a whisper in the distance, but they were unmistakable. Rachel froze. Her body went rigid, and she held her breath, straining to listen. Was someone in the room with them? Was someone speaking to her? Help me. It was so faint, but it sounded so real. She turned quickly, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. But there was no one there. No one except for her friends, who were fast asleep, unaware of the terror that had overtaken her. She turned back to the window, staring into the darkness. Her mind was racing. She wanted to scream, to wake up the others, but the fear in her chest held her back. She didn't know what to do. By morning, the sense of unease hadn't left her. Rachel's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She hadn't slept at all. The whispers still lingered in her mind, and the image of the ghostly woman haunted her thoughts. She barely touched her breakfast, picking at the food with a shaky hand. "Hey, you all right?" Mark asked, noticing her as she stared blankly at the table. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Rachel forced a weak smile. I didn't sleep. I think I'm just exhausted." But it was more than that. She knew it. She could feel it deep inside. Something was wrong with this place. Something was watching them, following them, and it wasn't just in her mind. The others didn't seem to notice the same things. They were laughing and joking, completely oblivious to the strange happenings that had been occurring. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something that was lurking in the shadows, something that was going to make itself known. That's when it happened. They were getting ready to leave the hotel for the day when they noticed it. Something was on the floor near the foot of the bed. Dark, unmistakable stains. At first, they thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe some dirt or something spilled from last night's dinner. But when they moved closer, their hearts skipped a beat. The stains were fresh, dark red, like blood. They streaked across the floor in random patterns, staining the carpet. The marks were irregular, as if someone or something had dragged itself across the room. Rachel gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she took a step back. "What is that? What happened here?" The others froze, their eyes wide as they stared at the bloodstains, unsure of what they were looking at. "Those weren't there last night," Alex said, his voice low, disbelief creeping into his tone. "What the hell is going on here?" Rachel felt a chill creep down her spine. The room that had already felt haunted, filled with whispers and shadows, now felt like a tomb, as though the hotel was mocking them, showing them a glimpse of something far darker than they had anticipated. And in that moment, they all knew it was real. The whispers, the figure in the window, the chilling cold. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was happening. And it was far worse than any of them could have imagined. Something in the hotel had marked them. And now, there was no turning back. They woke up the next morning, exhausted, drained, and still shaken by the events of the previous night. The light outside had barely touched the sky, a soft gray that seemed to settle over the city like a blanket. And yet, the oppressive atmosphere in their room remained. The room was quieter than usual. The only sound, the soft rustle of the curtains as the wind outside stirred the air. As they lay in bed, unwilling to get up, the silence was thick, like the world outside had been muted by something far darker. It was Rachel who noticed first. She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the fog of a sleepless night, and looked around the room. She froze. Her heart skipped a beat, and her blood ran cold. She saw it immediately. The walls were covered in dark red streaks, lines of what seemed like blood, splattered and smeared in thick, uneven patterns. The bloodstains. Alex was the first to sit up, rubbing his eyes. clearly confused by Rachel's sudden alarm. But when he looked around, his face went pale. Mark, who had been snoring lightly on the other side of the room, awoke with a start, and the three of them sat in stunned silence, eyes wide, staring at the red marks that marred the room. It was like the room itself had been defiled. Something was wrong, something that no explanation could fit. The red stains looked fresh, but there was something off about them. They didn't look like blood you'd find in an accident or crime scene. The texture wasn't quite right. It was thick, almost viscous, and the color was darker, almost too perfect, too deliberate. The way it moved on the walls, streaked in thin, tangled lines. It almost seemed as if the room itself had been alive, bleeding in slow, calculated drips. Rachel, still shaking, tentatively stepped forward, reaching out with a trembling hand to touch the marks on the wall. The moment her fingers made contact, a strange feeling washed over her, a jolt of something both cold and warm at the same time. She recoiled quickly, wiping her fingers on her pajama sleeves. But the sensation lingered, a sickening, crawling feeling that made her want to vomit. "What the hell is this?" Alex muttered, his voice strained as he stepped back, his gaze darting around the room in panic. His eyes landed on the floor, where the red stains pooled in patches, as though something or someone had dragged across the room, leaving a trail of blood in their wake. Mark got up from his bed and walked over to the corner of the room where the stains seemed heaviest. His face twisted with disgust as he crouched down to get a closer look. It wasn't just the blood, it was the smell. It was faint at first, but as he moved closer, it became undeniable. It didn't smell like blood at all. It had a sweet, rotten odor, like something had been left to decay for years in a forgotten corner. It was nauseating. His stomach churned as he covered his nose with the sleeve of his shirt. "Doesn't smell like blood, though," Mark muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "It's sickly sweet, like something's rotting in here." Rachel stepped back, horrified. "It's like it's been here forever," she whispered, "like the stains were always meant to be here." The others didn't respond right away, their minds racing to make sense of what they were seeing. But no matter how much they stared at it, the stains made no sense. They looked too intentional, too exact in their placement, as if someone had carefully arranged them. They didn't look like the aftermath of an accident or even a murder. They felt different. It was as if the stains were part of the room itself, a part of the building that had been waiting for them. "We have to clean this," Rachel said, trying to snap herself out of the daze she had fallen into. She turned to look around the room, desperate to make it go away. They all rushed to grab towels and cleaning supplies, scrubbing at the walls, the curtains, and the floor in frantic motions. But no matter how hard they tried, no matter how many times they wiped at the marks, the stains wouldn't come off. It was like the blood was embedded in the very fabric of the room. "This doesn't make sense," Mark said, panic creeping into his voice. "We're scrubbing it, but it's not going away. It's like it's a part of the room itself, like it belongs here." Rachel stood there, frozen in shock. The room felt colder now, the air thick with the metallic stench of something ancient. The walls seemed to close in on her, as the whispers from the night before began again. Just faint echoes at first, but they grew louder, more insistent. She could hear them now, clear as day, echoing in her mind, their words unintelligible, like a chant or prayer in a language she didn't recognize. "Stop," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Stop cleaning. It's not going to work. It's part of the hotel." The others turned to look at her, their expressions confused, but Rachel's eyes were wild, and her face was pale. She didn't know how to explain it, but she knew, deep down, that they were trapped. That whatever was happening wasn't something that could be scrubbed away. This was something far more sinister. The hotel was not just a building. It was alive, feeding off their fear, pulling them deeper into its web. At that moment, there was a soft knock at the door. "Who could that be?" Alex said, his voice tight with unease. They hadn't expected anyone, and yet the knock felt too deliberate, too timed. They hesitated before opening the door, their hearts pounding in their chests. When they opened it, an elderly man stood in the hallway, his back slightly hunched with age, his eyes cold and distant. He was the same man they had seen behind the front desk the day before. His expression didn't change when he saw them, but his gaze flicked over the room briefly before settling back on them. "You've seen it," he said quietly, his voice raspy but firm. "The blood, it never goes away." The three of them exchanged uneasy glances, not knowing what to say. "You shouldn't have come here," the man continued, his voice lower now, as if he were sharing a secret. "You've been marked. You can't leave once you're marked by the hotel. It's a part of it now. It won't let you go." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The friends stood in stunned silence, the weight of his words settling in around them. "What do you mean?" Rachel finally managed to choke out. "What is—" The elderly man's eyes narrowed, and he leaned in slightly, almost as if he were afraid someone might overhear. "This hotel isn't just a place," he whispered. "It's a trap. A prison for the lost, for those who've been touched by its curse. And once it marks you, you become part of it. You can never leave." And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadowed hallway, leaving them standing there, unable to move, unable to speak. It took a moment for them to process what he had said, and then they realized the horrifying truth. The blood wasn't just a stain. It wasn't something they could wipe away. It was a warning, and they were already too deep to turn back. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and terror. The once close-knit group of friends had started to unravel, their minds slowly fraying as the horrors they had experienced continued to escalate. Each day felt like a new descent into madness, a new layer of the hotel's twisted influence seeping deeper into their souls. What had started as whispers and fleeting shadows now became undeniable, tangible, manifestations. It was as though the hotel was no longer content with merely haunting them. It wanted to break them, to pull them apart, piece by piece, until they were just shells of who they once were. The hallucinations started small at first. It was just a flicker in the corner of their eyes. A figure walking down the hallway when no one else was around. A soft, brushing sound coming from the walls that couldn't be explained. They all brushed it off at first, attributing it to stress or lack of sleep. But it became harder to ignore with each passing day. The once familiar hallways began to feel alien, as though they were shifting, changing with every step they took. The wallpaper seemed to ripple, and the shadows stretched unnaturally long, never quite fitting into the spaces they were cast into. It was as if the building itself was warping, bending reality, making the very air feel thick and oppressive. Mark was the first to show signs of true distress. It started one night when he awoke, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers from the night before had turned into something else entirely. He had heard them clearly, but they weren't just faint murmurs this time. No, these were full conversations. Conversations that weren't his own, but seemed to be happening in the room with him. He could make out fragments of words, bits and pieces of dialogue, none of which made sense. It sounded like they were speaking in a language he couldn't understand, yet at the same time, he felt like he knew what they were saying. It was as if the voices were talking about people who had been there before them, guests who had stayed in that very room, people who had vanished without a trace. Mark's eyes darted around the room, trying to find the source of the voices. But when he looked, no one was there. It was just him, and the sound pressing against his eardrums, too close, too real. The voices continued, always the same, talking about things that didn't belong to him, things he couldn't possibly know, names he'd never heard, events that had happened long before he'd ever set foot in the hotel. His mind raced as the voices grew louder, the words clearer, more insistent. He tried to ignore them, but it was impossible. The more he tried to shut them out, the more they filled his head, until they were all he could hear, all he could think about. "Mark, are you all right?" Rachel's voice cut through the haze, and he looked up, startled. She had woken up from the sound of his frantic movements. "Did you hear that?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. "The voices. They're talking about people who've stayed here before. Mark, calm down," Rachel interrupted, her brow furrowing in concern. "There's nothing there. It's just the stress. We've all been through a lot." But Mark wasn't convinced. He could still hear them, the voices swirling in his mind, coming from every direction. He sat up, his hands gripping his head, as though trying to hold his thoughts together. But the more he listened, the more he realized that the voices weren't just random. They were telling him something important. "Mark, it's okay. You need to rest," Rachel said, but her voice was distant, as if she were speaking to him from far away. Mark shook his head. "No, it's not okay. They're here. They're watching us. They won't stop." For the rest of the night, Mark didn't sleep. He sat wide-eyed in the bed, his mind racing, listening to the voices that wouldn't stop, that kept echoing in his ears like a broken record. By morning, he was a shell of himself, pale, trembling, and barely able to form a sentence. The others noticed the change in him, but they didn't know how to help. No one did. The voices continued the next night and the next, growing louder and more insistent with each passing hour. Mark's once bright eyes had become hollow, and his movements were slow, sluggish, as if he were drifting in a waking nightmare. He stopped speaking to the others, his eyes darting nervously around the room, his body constantly on edge. It was as though the hotel had taken hold of him, pulling him deeper into its grasp, forcing him to listen to the things he wasn't meant to hear. Rachel and Alex tried to reach out to him to make sense of the madness consuming him, but it was like trying to communicate with someone on the other side of a thick glass wall. Mark no longer seemed like the person they had known. He had become a shadow of himself, a person lost in the labyrinth of his own mind, pulled further and further from reality. The whispers had taken him, and there was nothing they could do to bring him back. Then on the fourth night, something far worse happened. Mark vanished. It was as if he had simply evaporated from the room. They woke up in the middle of the night to find his bed empty, the sheets twisted and thrown aside, but there was no sign of him anywhere. No sign of a struggle, no clue as to where he had gone. The room was eerily still, the air thick with the scent of decay that seemed to be creeping up from the walls. Rachel and Alex called his name, panic rising in their throats as they searched the room, the hallway, and the entire hotel. "Mark!" Rachel shouted, her voice trembling with fear. "Mark, where are you?" But there was no answer. They searched the hotel, room by room, calling out for him, but it was as if he had never been there at all. The hotel seemed to stretch endlessly, the hallways twisting and turning in impossible ways, as though the very structure of the building had changed overnight. It was as if the hotel had swallowed Mark whole, and he had simply ceased to exist. No, this isn't happening," Alex muttered, his voice breaking as he pounded on the walls, his mind racing. He can't just be gone. He can't. But the hotel offered no answers. It was as if the building itself had swallowed him up, leaving no trace behind. The panic set in. The fear that had been building over the past few days now surged to the surface. The terror that had been creeping under their skin, making them question their reality, had become too real to ignore. They were trapped. They were trapped in this cursed hotel, with no way out. Mark was gone, and there was no one to tell them what had happened to him or why. It was as if the hotel was playing some twisted game, pulling them deeper into its grip with every passing hour. The sense of hopelessness settled over them like a dark cloud, and they realized, with a sickening certainty, that they were stuck here, caught in the nightmare that had consumed their friend. There was no escape, not for Mark, not for any of them. The hotel wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it wanted them. It had already taken one of them, and now it was waiting for the rest. As the days stretched on, the oppressive atmosphere of the hotel became more suffocating. Rachel and Alex barely spoke to each other, lost in their own spiraling thoughts, but the fear in their eyes mirrored each other's. The walls of the hotel which had once seemed merely old and dilapidated, now felt as though they were closing in on them. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, every whisper from the walls seemed to be a reminder that they were no longer in control. They could feel it now. With every passing moment, something was watching them, something that wanted them to stay, something that wasn't going to let them leave. The whispers, which had started as faint murmurs, had now grown into distinct voices, voices that spoke directly to them, calling their names in low, seductive tones. Sometimes, the voices sounded like people they knew, and other times, like the people who had once inhabited this place. Screams from the past, forever trapped within the hotel's decaying walls. The shadows seemed to move on their own, creeping into every corner of the room, following them as they tried to move through the hallways. But the worst part, the part that made their skin crawl, was the feeling that they were never truly alone. It wasn't just their minds playing tricks on them. There was something in the hotel with them, something that had been there for centuries, feeding off their fear, their anxiety. It was on the third night, after hours of restless pacing and fruitless attempts to leave, that Rachel and Alex finally made the decision to dig deeper. They had to understand what was happening to them. What kind of evil had taken hold of the place? The hotel was clearly more than just a haunted building. It was alive in ways that defied logic, and it had its grip on them. They ventured to the old, forgotten library in the back of the hotel, a room that had been sealed off for as long as they could remember. The dust in the air was thick, and the floor creaked with every step they took. But it was the only place left in the hotel that hadn't been touched by the unrelenting force that had been stalking them. The shelves were filled with old, forgotten books, yellowed with age, their spines cracked and brittle. Most of the books had been written in languages they couldn't read, but it didn't matter. They needed to find answers. They needed to understand what had happened here, what kind of evil had been allowed to fester in this place. As Rachel pulled a dusty book from the shelf, her fingers trembling, she felt an unnatural chill run through her. It wasn't the cold that had been present in the hotel from the start. It was something far worse, something that made her heart race. She opened the book, revealing pages of strange symbols and faded writing, some of which seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. There, in the back of the book, hidden between the lines of text, was a story that had been buried, forgotten by time, and yet, somehow, still managed to find its way to the surface. The hotel, it turned out, had once been a prison, a place where political prisoners were held during the late 1700s. But it wasn't just any prison. It was a place of unspeakable horrors. The people who had been locked within the walls of the hotel had been subjected to brutal torture, their cries for mercy echoing through the halls for days, weeks, even months. The tortures they endured were beyond anything Rachel or Alex could have imagined. Whippings, starvation, psychological torment, and worse. There were rumors that some of the prisoners had been driven mad, that the pain had broken them beyond repair, and they had been left to die in the very cells where they had been tortured. The book spoke of blood, how the floor had soaked up the blood of countless innocent people, their pain and suffering forever staining the stones of the building. As they read further, they discovered the dark secret of the hotel's history. The torture that took place within its walls had been so intense, so vile, that it had left a mark on the very fabric of the hotel itself. The souls of the tortured prisoners had never been allowed to leave. They were trapped, their spirits bound to the building, their pain and anger festering, creating an energy that soaked into the very walls of the hotel. Over the years, this dark energy had only grown stronger, feeding off the fear of those who stayed within its walls. The hotel didn't just house the dead, it absorbed them. The souls of the tortured, the blood of the innocent, and the madness of those who had been driven insane became part of the hotel, fusing with the structure, turning it into something far worse than a mere haunted building. The bloodstains they had seen, the ones that had marked the walls, the floor, and the curtains, were not just stains left behind by some forgotten tragedy. They were remnants. Remnants of the souls trapped inside the hotel. Their anguish etched into the very building. These stains weren't simply a byproduct of death. They were the manifestation of the tortured souls crying out for release, trying to make their presence known to anyone foolish enough to enter. The blood wasn't just a warning. It was a symbol, a mark of possession. Anyone who entered the hotel and encountered the bloodstains was marked by the building itself. They became a part of its history, a part of its curse. Rachel and Alex's hearts sank as they read the final passage of the book, one that confirmed their worst fears. The hotel didn't just trap souls, it fed on them. The more fear the hotel could induce, the stronger it became. Those who stayed in the hotel, those who were marked, were not simply haunted. They were consumed. The building didn't want to release its prisoners. It wanted to keep them there, trapped forever, turning them into part of the hotel's twisted, decaying soul. As they closed the book, the weight of the knowledge settled in. The whispers had always been more than just sounds. They were the voices of the tortured souls, trying to communicate, to warn them. The figures they had seen, the shifting shadows in the corners of their eyes, weren't figments of their imagination. They were the ghosts of the prisoners, still trapped in the hotel, reaching out to them. The bloodstains, the cold, the whispers, everything had a purpose. The hotel was marking them, just as it had marked the souls before them. They were becoming part of the hotel's dark history, and there was no escape. They tried to leave. They ran through the hallways, screaming for the door, for any sign of a way out. But it was too late. The hotel wasn't going to let them go. It was as if the walls themselves had closed in, shifting and twisting to keep them inside. The doors wouldn't open, and the windows remained sealed shut. No matter how hard they tried, no matter how loudly they screamed, the hotel refused to release them. The truth was undeniable now. The hotel had claimed them. It had marked them, just as it had done to so many before. The souls of the tortured, the blood of the innocent, and the madness of the past had all become part of the building. And now, Rachel and Alex were part of it too. They were never going to leave. They were trapped in a never-ending cycle of suffering and fear, forever bound to the hotel's dark and twisted history.